The rubber trees around Nui Dat stood in rows like soldiers who never slept. Straight trunks, pale bark, leaves high above that didn't stop the heat so much as trap it. The base itself was still young, scraped out earth, sandbags, fresh wire, and the uneasy feeling of building something permanent in a place that wanted you gone. On the edge of that wire, 6 men waited with their packs already biting into their shoulders. They didn't look like a raiding party. No swagger, no extra gear hanging off them to advertise intention, just the bare minimum that only looks minimal until you try carrying it through jungle for days and nights. Across the track, 2 American advisors watched in silence. One of them, a captain with a clipboard and a face that always seemed to be calculating a margin of error, kept glancing at the sky as if helicopters were supposed to appear on schedule, because that was what made sense in the world he came from. But the sky stayed empty. No rotor wash, no orbiting gunship, no artillery line already plotted on a map for if things go bad, no convoy, no shadow, no quick reaction force rolling behind them like an insurance policy. The captain finally spoke, unable to leave the question buried. "You're walking?" The Australian patrol commander, Sergeant Tom Keegan, lean as wire, older than his years, didn't even turn his head. He checked the strap of his rifle, then the face of the man beside him as if confirming something unspoken. "Yeah," he said, "we'll walk." The American's mouth tightened. Into that, he meant the jungle. He meant the intelligence summaries. He meant the recent reports of movement, trails pressed into mud, caches discovered, the ghost signs of a force that wasn't supposed to be so close to a brand new base. Keegan shrugged like it was weather. That's where they are. What the Americans had trouble understanding wasn't bravery. They'd seen bravery. They'd seen men step into gunfire because it was either that or watch a friend die. What unsettled them was the calm arithmetic of it. 6 men, alone, pushing into an area the maps barely described, 20 square kilometers of green darkness, where the analysts were whispering words like company strength, sometimes even battalion presence. The captain had studied doctrine. He had read manuals that treated risk like a math problem you solved by adding resources. More firepower, more radios, more contingency plans. If you didn't have those things, you didn't go. But these men weren't going to fight an army. They were going to not be seen. That was the part that didn't translate. The patrol had a shape to it that came from years of selection and training and the kind of experience you only got in humid places with names that never made American headlines. Malaya, Borneo, campaigns where the jungle wasn't scenery. It was the enemy's greatest weapon and your only cover, if you learned how to become part of it. 6 men. Keegan, patrol commander, experienced, quiet, the kind of leader who didn't waste words because words were weight. Corporal Blue Mallory, second in command, steady, watchful, the one who would take over if Keegan didn't come back. Sparks Donnelly, the signaler, carrying the radio like a fragile heart. Doc Haynes, medic, trained to keep men alive with almost nothing. 2 scouts, Riley and Mason, who could read a bent blade of grass the way other men read a newspaper. They carried rifles chosen for reliability in wet heat, and one carried the patrol's heaviest voice, a light machine gun that could turn a desperate moment into an escape. But even that wasn't there to win battles. It was there to buy seconds. Their real weapon was discipline. By the time the first sun hit the wire, they were gone. They crossed the defensive perimeter without ceremony, moving through the cleared fields beyond Nui Dat and into the first line of jungle where the world changed instantly. Light strangled, air thick enough to chew, insects loud enough to mask a whispered curse, and dangerous enough to punish the smallest lapse. Inside, the patrol stretched into single file, spacing out until each man became a separate shadow. 5 meters, then 10, depending on the cover. Close enough to vanish together, far enough that one mistake didn't swallow them all. They moved at a pace that would have enraged any conventional commander, less than a kilometer an hour, often slower. It wasn't walking. It was placing yourself into the world without disturbing it. A step, a pause, a listening halt. And then the slow sweep of eyes across trunks, brush, shadowed gaps that could hide a man at arm's length. No talking. Not because silence was romantic, but because silence was survival. Hand signals did the work of language. Halt, crouch, watch left, watch right, danger, move. By mid-morning, the jungle had closed behind them like a door. On the first day, they weren't hunting camps. They were building a picture. The scout on point stopped, knelt, and held up a fist. Everyone froze, not in the exaggerated way movies show, but in that complete instant stillness that makes you feel your own heartbeat as a betrayal. Riley pointed, a faint line in the leaf litter, too straight, too consistent to be natural. Keegan leaned forward, eyes narrowing. A trail, not a game path, not the wandering line of pigs. This had purpose. The leaves were pressed down in a way that suggested boots, not hooves. The ground had been scuffed clean in places, as if the jungle itself had been erased by passing weight. They didn't step onto it. They studied it the way detectives study a crime scene. Compass bearing, width, depth of wear, the number of distinct prints where the soil had held a shape before the humidity softened it back into nothing. 1 trail meant movement, 2 trails meant routine, 3 converging and splitting meant a network, and networks meant organization. By early afternoon, they'd found more. A second trail, wider. A third, fresher, with a snapped vine still bleeding sap where something heavy had pushed through recently. The intelligence summaries back at Nui Dat had said increased activity. Now the jungle itself was confirming it. They chose a patrol base in dense vegetation off the trails, near water but not near the obvious water because obvious water attracted people. They picked ground with a way out, a shallow gully that could swallow them if the world suddenly turned loud. No tripwires, no claymores, no defensive engineering that would leave fingerprints, just camouflage and the kind of stillness that feels unnatural until you realize nature itself is still most of the time. They settled into it like animals. 2 men on watch, 2 resting, 2 observing. Rest wasn't sleep the way civilians understood it. It was closing your eyes while your body begged to shift position and you refused because shaking a branch could be death. Night came early under triple canopy. The jungle grew louder, not quieter. Frogs, insects, the distant cough of something large. Every sound could be life, or it could be human life. Keegan lay with his cheek against damp earth and listened for the one sound that mattered, a human footfall. When it came, faint, irregular, he didn't move. He didn't even breathe deeper. Mallory felt it too, sensed it through the tension that passed silently between them. A patrol, close. Not close in the way men in cities think of closeness. Close in the jungle meant within 10 meters and still invisible. The footsteps paused, a soft murmur of voices. Vietnamese, low, casual, like men who believed the night belonged to them. Keegan's fingers tightened around his rifle. Nothing else. No movement, no impatient shifting. The Australians became part of the ground. A flashlight would have found them if it passed across their faces, but no one used flashlights in that kind of jungle unless they wanted to die. So the Viet Cong patrol moved through darkness by instinct, by memory, by the same forest senses these 6 men were using against them. The voices drifted away. Only after the last sound faded did Keegan move his eyes toward Mallory. A look, nothing more. Still good, still ghosts. Day 2 began with heat so heavy it felt like a hand on the back of the neck. Now the patrol's job sharpened. They followed one of the wider trails, not on it but alongside, parallel, always offset, always using it as a guide without becoming part of it. If someone looked down the trail, they'd see nothing. If someone stepped off the trail to relieve himself behind a tree, he might be close enough to smell them. That possibility lived in their bones. By midday, the signs grew undeniable. Cut bamboo ends too clean to be natural, a scrap of cloth snagged on a thorn, the faint chemical tang of smoke that had been smothered but not erased. Then they found the first real proof. A cooking area, abandoned recently. Ash still gray, not yet washed into nothing, footprints everywhere. A shallow pit where someone had buried scraps to avoid leaving a scent. And beyond it, deeper into the green, voices. Keegan raised a hand. The line stopped. They didn't advance like men storming a position. They advanced like water seeping through cracks. Slow, patient, finding the path that made no noise. A meter at a time. Stop. Watch. Listen. The camp revealed itself in fragments, a tarp stretched between trees, low, almost invisible. The outline of a bunker with overhead cover built from logs and soil, a cluster of men squatting, cleaning weapons, smoking, talking. The camp wasn't huge, not yet, but it was organized, and it sat like a nerve center, a place men passed through rather than lived forever. The patrol slid into an observation position behind a fallen log, faces smeared, uniforms broken up with natural material until they were less men and more wrong shadows. Hours passed. They counted. They sketched layout in their minds. They watched who gave orders and who received them. They noted the angle of sentries, the gaps, the places where the perimeter was an assumption rather than a fact. They learned what weapons were present. They didn't need to see everything, just enough. A heavier machine gun on a crude mount, a mortar tube hidden under a tarp, boxes carried and stacked in a way that suggested ammunition rather than rice. The camp breathed. Men came and went. And then the dangerous part happened. A local security element moved past the observation position, so close the patrol could hear the soft clink of gear, could smell sweat and tobacco, and the faint sourness of fermented fish. An insect crawled across Mason's cheek, slow and determined. He did not brush it away. His eye watered. His jaw clenched. He stayed stone still because motion, not discomfort, killed you. The Viet Cong moved on. Keegan felt the tension in his chest ease by a fraction, then locked it down again. Because the jungle had a cruel habit, it would grant you one escape to make you believe you'd earn the next. As afternoon collapsed into evening, it became clear the camp was only part of the picture. Traffic increased. More men arrived. Some carried heavier loads. Some carried radio equipment. Keegan watched a group gather around one man who seemed older, more confident. Briefing posture, heads angled in, a finger pointing on a crude map drawn in dirt. This wasn't a resting place. This was preparation. Mallory leaned close enough to Keegan that their shoulders nearly touched. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes said it. They're moving soon. Standard logic said, pull back, transmit what you have, let the big guns and aircraft handle the rest. But standard logic was what made Americans comfortable. It wasn't always what won in the jungle. Keegan made the decision in silence. They would stay, overnight, close enough to smell the camp, close enough that discovery would mean no clean extraction and no heroic last stand anyone would write about. They rotated observation shifts under the cover of darkness so slow it barely counted as movement. They watched men sleep. They watched men smoke. They watched men walk perimeter lines with a casual confidence that only comes when you believe the jungle is on your side. Near midnight, a column began forming, not a full unit yet, but enough to make Keegan's mouth go dry. They weren't leaving randomly. They were assembling with purpose. The patrol watched the direction of their departure, the spacing, the discipline. They listened for the details that mattered, the number of footfalls, the occasional whispered command, the clatter that suggested heavier weapons weapons being moved. By the time the last of that group faded, Keegan knew something the base at Nui Dat didn't. This area wasn't just occupied, it was becoming a launch point. At first light, Keegan pulled the team back a short distance, not retreating, just shifting to avoid patterns. They ate a few mouthfuls of compressed rations, bitter and dry, and drank water that tasted like iodine and leaf rot. They were already tired, not from walking, from being constantly awake inside their own heads. Then they found the second set of trails, wider, fresher, multiple paths converging like veins feeding a heart. Mason crouched and traced a print in mud with a fingertip. It wasn't a sandal, it wasn't barefoot, boot, more than one. And the scuff marks weren't scattered, they were repeated, layered, the kind of traffic you got when dozens of men moved through the same place in a short window. Keegan looked up into the jungle and felt, for the first time, that they were no longer observing the enemy. They were inside the enemy's body. They moved again, slower than before. Midday became their friend because enemy security often relaxed under the crushing heat. Men dozed. Sentries shaded their eyes. The jungle itself dripped and steamed and muffled everything. The patrol used that. They avoided the obvious routes and slid around them. They crawled when they had to. They froze when birds went silent, because birds went silent for a reason. Near late afternoon, they reached a rise where the vegetation thinned just enough to offer broken sightlines into a low area beyond. And what they saw there wasn't a camp, it was an area. Multiple positions, dispersed, intelligently placed, overhead cover that suggested experience with airstrikes, interlocking arcs that suggested someone had been taught or had learned the hard way, men in numbers that made counting difficult without revealing your presence. Keegan's throat tightened. This was no company. This was a force that could swallow Nui Dat's perimeter patrols whole if it moved in the right direction. And the signs of preparation were everywhere. Weapons checked, packs adjusted, leaders gathering small groups for instructions, movement that had rhythm to it, organized, timed, purposeful. The patrol had the most valuable thing in war, knowledge of what the enemy planned before the enemy did it. But knowledge was only useful if it reached someone who could act on it. Sparks Donnelly didn't set up the radio. He performed a ritual, silent, practiced, efficient. The set stayed buried in his pack until the last possible moment. Antenna kept low, never raised like a flag. His hands moved without hesitation because hesitation wasted seconds, and seconds were everything. Keegan watched the jungle, not Sparks, because the moment the patrol transmitted, they stopped being invisible and started being traceable. Sparks glanced at his watch. Burst transmissions weren't conversations. They were a punch, short, coded, encrypted, sent fast enough to minimize the enemy's chance of triangulating the signal. Coordinates, strength estimates, layout details, signs of imminent movement, likely direction of advance. Keegan had already decided what mattered most. Not every bunker, not every tarp, and cooking fire. What mattered was that a large element, maybe larger than command believed, was staging within reach of Nui Dat, and it was preparing to move soon. Sparks' thumb pressed the key. For a few seconds, the jungle had a new sound, the invisible crackle of a message slicing through humid air. Then it was gone. A heartbeat later, Sparks was packing it away again, as if the radio had never existed. No one spoke. No one moved more than necessary. Keegan stared into the trees, waiting for a reaction that might never come. Or might come too late. A minute passed. 2. Birds called again. Insects kept screaming. Somewhere far off, something heavy crashed through undergrowth, too far to tell whether it was animal or man. Keegan breathed carefully through his nose. Right, he whispered at last, the first word in hours. We go. Because transmitting was only half the problem. Now they had to leave. And leaving was when men died. The patrol shifted away from the observation position like smoke slipping under a door. They did not backtrack. They did not take the trail. They chose a route that would make sense to no one watching them, because no one could watch what they couldn't see. They moved in a wide arc, cutting across terrain that punished every step, mud that sucked at boots, vines that grabbed, hidden roots that waited to break ankles, a jungle floor that looked flat until you put weight on it and discovered it wasn't. They were already operating on the edge of their supplies. The 3-day load was a lie all patrols told themselves, because it only worked if nothing unexpected happened. And something unexpected always happened in the jungle, even if it was just time. Water was the first enemy. Streams existed, but streams also carried disease, and you couldn't drink freely. Every refill required tablets and waiting and the patience to not gulp like a dying man. Food was next. Rations were compact, designed for efficiency, but they weren't designed to calm the part of the brain that screamed when you knew you were surrounded. Mostly, they ate to silence that scream. And fatigue. Fatigue was the real predator, not the kind you felt after a long march, the kind that crawled into the bones when you hadn't slept properly in days because your mind wouldn't permit it. The patrol's discipline had a simple rule: never relax. Men relaxed when they thought the hard part was over. Men died because they thought the hard part was over. So they moved with the same slow care, even when every muscle begged them to hurry. The jungle, of course, tested them. On the first night of withdrawal, Mason froze so hard his entire body locked. He lifted a hand, fingers spread. Danger. Keegan slid up beside him, eyes narrowed, following the line of Mason's gaze. A faint glow through trees, not moonlight, not insects, a cigarette. Close enough that the smell of smoke was real. They dropped low, not in panic, in acceptance. Because this was what the jungle did. It placed the enemy directly in your path and waited to see what you were made of. The Viet Cong element, 2 men, maybe 3, stood on the far side of a shallow depression, talking softly as if the night belonged to them. One laughed, brief and tired. Keegan watched their posture, not alert, not hunting, just moving along a route they'd walked 100 times. Mallory shifted his weight so slightly that it might have been a leaf settling. Keegan's hand came up, palm down. Hold. The Australian stayed pressed to the earth, bodies melting into shadow, and waited out the danger the way you waited out a storm, by refusing to challenge it. The cigarette ember moved, bobbing away. Voices faded. When the last hint of smoke was gone, the patrol moved again, slower than before, because the jungle had told them something important. They were not slipping out through empty space. They were moving through occupied territory that was alive with eyes and feet and routines. The next day was worse. Heat returned like punishment, the kind that made your uniform feel like wet cloth glued to skin, the kind that turned every halt into an argument inside your mind. Stop and cool down, or keep moving before someone walks into you. Keegan chose movement. He chose uneven ground that discouraged travel. He chose stream beds where footprints washed away. He chose ridgelines where sight was broken and sound carried differently. He avoided the simplest path because the simplest path was where people walked. At one point, Riley signaled and led them to a place where the jungle had been disturbed recently. Branches broken at shoulder height, leaves stripped in a narrow corridor. A unit had moved through, not long ago. The patrol studied it without stepping into it. They read the chaos the way trackers read snow, how heavy the loads were, how disciplined the spacing had been, whether men had been tired enough to stumble. The signs suggested purpose. Keegan felt cold despite the heat. They're moving too, and that meant the patrol wasn't just trying to get home. They were trying to get home before the enemy's wave rolled toward Nui Dat. By late afternoon, Sparks found a place with slightly better ground and looked up at Keegan with a question in his eyes. Another transmission? Keegan hesitated. Every message carried risk. Every broadcast was a flare to anyone listening, but silence carried its own risk. Command might act too late, or not act with enough force, or misunderstand what the patrol had really seen. Keegan nodded once. Sparks sent a second, even shorter burst. Confirmation of movement indicators, likely timing, and the patrol's intent to return on foot. Then the radio vanished again, and the patrol moved on. Night again. They navigated by compass and pace count, the kind of method that feels primitive until you understand it's the only thing you can trust when darkness eats the map. No GPS, no glowing screens, no satellites, just a needle, a count in your head, and the memory of terrain. Keegan's world narrowed into tiny decisions. Where to place a boot, when to halt, how to angle around a patch of bamboo that would snap loud as gunfire if you forced it. At one point, they crossed a trail so wide and worn it felt like stepping over a road. Mallory paused and lifted a finger. Listen, a distant clatter of metal. Voices. Too far to identify. Close enough to be real. The patrol stayed still until the sounds drifted away. Then they crossed, one by one, stepping where the ground was hardest to avoid, leaving any mark that mattered. By the time the first signs of the base perimeter began to show, faint cut lines, slightly less chaotic vegetation, the subtle absence of enemy trails, the patrol felt like it had been underwater for days and was finally surfacing. But they didn't rush, because the last cruelty in a mission like this was how easy it would be to die right at the end. A mine, a sentry misunderstanding, a moment of relief that made you loud. Keegan waited until he was absolutely certain, then used a prearranged signal. Something simple, something that told Australian sentries on the wire friendlies inbound. When the wire finally appeared, it didn't look heroic. It looked like rusted metal and sandbags and men who were too tired to celebrate. They crossed in the dim light before dawn. No shots fired, no contact, no dramatic extraction, just 6 ghosts stepping back into the human world. Inside the perimeter, they were met not with cheers, but with urgency. They went straight to debrief, hours of it. Keegan spoke quietly, but every word carried weight. Sparks provided timings and transmission records. The scouts described trails and traffic. Doc Haynes reported the physical condition of the team like it mattered, because it did. Fatigue was intelligence too, a measure of how hard the environment punished operations. In the intelligence tent, maps spread out, transparent overlays marked with grease pencil, coordinates plotted and replotted, the shape of the enemy's staging area emerging like a dark continent. Photos, grainy, limited, taken through impossible foliage, were developed and inspected. Even when the images were unclear, the details around them were not. The conclusion was brutal and immediate. A significant Viet Cong formation had been operating closer to Nui Dat than some estimates suggested, with signs of imminent movement. And now Australian Command had something it could use. Actionable intelligence that wasn't days old, gathered not from aircraft or intercepted radio chatter, but from men who had crawled close enough to smell the enemy's cigarettes. The response was fast. Patrol routes adjusted, defensive positions reviewed, fire plans revised to cover likely approach corridors the patrol had identified, units repositioned not because someone had a bad feeling, but because 6 men had watched the enemy rehearse the future. Within days, Allied operations pushed into areas the patrol had marked, sometimes with infantry, sometimes with artillery, sometimes with air power where terrain allowed. Battle damage assessments in jungle war were never clean. The enemy didn't leave receipts, but follow-up sweeps found signs that mattered. Abandoned positions, disrupted movement, caches moved hastily, the residue of a force forced to change plans. The patrol's greatest victory wasn't a body count, it was a decision forced, a plan interrupted, a blow prevented. And back at Nui Dat, something changed in the way certain American officers looked at the Australians. Not admiration, something closer to recalibration. Because it wasn't just that the Australians had survived, it was how they'd operated. 6 men men, deep, alone, disciplined to an almost unnatural degree, gathering intelligence that larger forces couldn't collect without announcing themselves. The Australians didn't call it bravery, they called it doctrine, a doctrine forged in counterinsurgency campaigns where the jungle punished noise and rewarded patience, where firepower didn't matter if you couldn't find the enemy before he found you. And that doctrine came with a psychological price. You had to be built for isolation, for silence so long it felt like a physical thing, for the mental discipline to let insects crawl across your face and do nothing, for the restraint to avoid firefights not because you were afraid to fight, but because fighting would mean you'd failed your real mission. This was the part few outsiders truly grasped. Special reconnaissance wasn't about heroics, it was about refusing the ego that wanted to do something and instead doing what mattered. The selection process that created men like Keegan, Mallory, Sparks, Doc, Riley, and Mason didn't just test fitness. It tested character under exhaustion, fear under isolation, judgment under uncertainty. Because deep in enemy territory, there was no commander looking over your shoulder to tell you what to do. There was only your patrol leader's decision and your ability to live with it. In the months and years that followed, Australian SAS patrols in Vietnam continued to operate in that same stripped-down way. Small teams, deep penetration, extended isolation, minimal transmissions, and obsession with stealth. And the enemy noticed. The Viet Cong had names for many things, but the name that clung to these men, again and again in different areas from different mouths, carried a simple meaning: ghosts. Not because they were supernatural, but because they appeared where they shouldn't be, saw what they shouldn't be able to see, and vanished without leaving a trace. Later in the war, there would be patrols that stayed out longer. 6 days, 7, sometimes more, shadowing larger enemy units, building a picture so complete it felt like reading the other side's diary. There would be missions where artillery and airstrikes landed on positions that had seemed invisible the week before because someone had crawled close enough to map them with a pencil and a heartbeat. But it started with mornings like this one in 1966. A brand new base at Nui Dat, a jungle that swallowed sound, and 6 men walking past Allied command into green darkness without backup, without spectacle, without the safety nets that made conventional planning feel comfortable, trusting only discipline, patience, and the ruthless belief that in that kind of war, survival didn't belong to the loudest force. It belonged to the men who could become nothing at all.